So we are the bigger picture piece of this session. So the title of the presentation, Creating Space, Aligning Motivation, and Building Trust. These are not trade-offs. We want all of these things. And so I'm going to present the results of a stakeholder paper that all of the exemplars have worked on, a number of people in this room. And just first a thank you to everybody who contributed. I'm Heather. I help coordinate across all 12 exemplars and also lead the wine exemplar. So as those of you who are X hopefully remember, we had proposed doing a paper on stakeholder engagement across the exemplars. And this came out of a milestone where we were supposed to look at evaluating processes within the exemplars. And we realized stakeholder engagement is something that, of course, all of us are involved in and have had very different experiences with. And we wanted to see, what has been working, what hasn't been working so well. Are there common things that we should all keep in mind when doing stakeholder engagement? And so we looked at things such as how do you identify your stakeholders, at what points in the projects do you bring them in, how do you engage them, be it workshops, surveys, what have you. If you had existing relationships with these stakeholders already, and how the stakeholders got along with each other. And so since X, we've written the paper. And right now we're going to leave it as an internal Opera's resource for now, so it will be up, we'll get it up on OwnCloud and the website within the next, hopefully, few days. And then we're going to integrate this into our larger synthesis deliverable that's due next year. So this is already sort of a mini synthesis, and we're thinking ahead to bigger syntheses. So in terms of our research question, as I said, we're looking at what are the key elements that we should consider in stakeholder engagement. And we realized there's a lot written about why to do stakeholder engagement, and I think we hopefully would all agree it's an important thing to do, especially within operas. And there's a fair number of things out there about how to. So the tools to actually do it, Biodiversa has a very good stakeholder engagement handbook. But what we realized was missing was this kind of middle piece. Like, what's the bigger questions to consider, the bigger issues before you dive into the details. And in the conversation earlier about cultural ecosystem services, and Craig and Samantha were saying, cultural ecosystem services are sort of lacking a guiding theory, or in this case, kind of guiding principle. So that's the level that we thought was missing, and that we could maybe fill a gap with the research we've done. Just one caveat, this is from the researcher's perspective, so this is not from the stakeholder perspective, but we thought we provide the most information from the researcher perspective since we are researchers. In terms of how we did this, a lot of you know this because you were involved in it. We sent out surveys before the X meeting that asked you how you did things, and then in X, interviewed each of the exemplar leads about how did things go. So how well do you think your stakeholder identification process worked? Were there things you'd do differently? What do you wish you'd known before you started? And then Kim and I did a qualitative analysis to determine some of the key groupings and themes that came out of all of the wonderful information that you provided us with. And we came up with 12 components. I won't go through all of these, and there's a reason they're in little groups. But these were the 12 key themes that came out from all of your interview responses. It happens to be coincidence that there's 12 exemplars and 12 components. It's not one component per exemplar or anything like that. I've got some questions about that. And I won't define them all, but this lovely table is in the paper, goes through what they are. I can call out a few. These were the most common things mentioned across the interview responses. Things such as, operas is really an opportunity to bring a lot of people together from different backgrounds, different disciplines, to have a space for critical discussion. Things in terms of, that have already come up today, framing, for example, ecosystem services as a term might not resonate with stakeholders, even though the concept might be there. Similarly, researchers and stakeholders may have different goals, or stakeholders themselves may have different goals between them. And also a lot of responses about building relationships and how do you go about that, the time it takes to do that. So these were the 12 key things that we saw coming out of the interviews. And again, we grouped these. We realized there's higher level groupings as well. And we came up with our 3 key elements of stakeholder engagement, which we say are space, motivation, and trust. Space, as I mentioned, refers to both the physical space, like we're all here together, but also just the conceptual space in that Operas provides an opportunity to bring together a lot of different viewpoints and stakeholders. Motivation is about, what are our goals in stakeholder engagement, and similarly, what are the stakeholders' goals, and how do you align those two? So where there are differences, or where there are maybe different expectations for amount of involvement or amount of influence. Motivation is about sort of understanding where we're coming from and setting expectations on both sides. And then finally, trust. This was all around relationship building. So how do you build trust with stakeholders in order to do the work that you want to do? So we propose that these three bigger things are common among all the exemplars, but as with everything, context matters, and so there's no one right way to go about this, and the exemplars have all gone about it differently. So I have two examples. In the case of the wine exemplar, we started out with a space for a brand new exemplar, had a project, we needed some stakeholders, so we went and we tried to work with a new wine growing region in which we did not have pre-existing relationships, and it was a region we hadn't worked in before. And we realized that what the stakeholders needed were not necessarily what we could offer, and it became apparent we weren't actually totally sure what our goals were. So we went back, forward, back, there we go, and really thought through, okay, what are our goals in this project, and solidified those, and now have been able to go to stakeholders with a much clearer plan of what we can offer the stakeholders and what we hope to do. On the other hand, Barcelona, which we'll hear a lot about tomorrow, which we're very excited about, started with very clear motivation in terms of constructing dunes, then went to stakeholders, so the administration and the citizens separately, and now are looking to bring those two groups together, which I understand is going to be happening in the future. So again, these are just two examples of different ways of going about things that are still some common elements. One other thing we found interesting that varied, I showed those 12 components, and each of those also can vary with context. So they can play out in both positive and negative ways, depending on your project. Just one example from each. Different exemplars had different opinions about whether to bring together stakeholders who might not agree with each other. So on the one hand, some exemplars thought this was a great idea for stakeholders to build understanding and knowledge between each other. Some thought, this could lead to conflicts, or did lead to conflicts. We should, strategically engage them at different times. One example under motivation, when you bring your stakeholders in. So you can bring them at the very beginning of the project to help define the problem. That can help ensure you're meeting their needs at the same time, sort of what happened with the wine exemplar. We ended up with a chicken and egg situation in which the stakeholders wanted to engage with us, we wanted to engage with them, but they wanted to know what we could offer, and we wanted to know what they needed. And so it was, I think if we'd had a more clear picture up front, that might have been a good idea. So maybe don't bring them right at the beginning. So again, depends on context. And finally, an example under trust, bringing in a number of exemplars, mentioned having a key person, so someone with a good network or with a reputation who can help you to build a stakeholder network and build connections. This can work fantastically well. It can also work not as well if it turns out this person isn't necessarily the best person in the community to have engaged. So again, one example I ran into this where the person we tried to work with actually was rather divisive, and that didn't work out so well. So again, these are just things to keep in mind as you approach stakeholder engagement before you go to the details of who do we get and who do we involve and how do we involve them. And finally, conclusions. Again, we're saying that if you want to build productive researcher-stakeholder relationships, consider the type of space you want to create. So bringing together different people, providing a space for critical discussion. There's talk of different groups being able to be kind of a conduit between others. So in Danny's exemplar, as an NGO, you're able to bridge different parties who may not talk directly to each other. Similarly with motivation, understanding our own motivations, and then being clear, talking with stakeholders about what do they want to get out of a project, how do they want to be involved, what do they hope that the results are. And finally, with trust, building relationships is always challenging, but considering things like, do you have existing relationships? Do you have the time to build relationships to the degree that you want people involved? Do you have a key person in the community? Are you part of that community? Can also help to foster that. So these are that's it. Those are our conclusions. As I said, our paper is 99% done. I have a couple little formatting tweaks, and we'll get it up on the Opera site. In terms of what we found so far in stakeholder engagement, and this will be rolled into our final synthesis in February.